Now the persecutions had extended to northern Africa, which was a Roman province, and many were murdered in that area. One of these was Perpetua, a married lady, 26 years old, with a baby at her breast. On being taken before the proconsul Minutius, Perpetua was commanded to sacrifice to the idols. Refusing to do so, she was put in a dark dungeon and deprived of her child. But two of her keepers, Tertius and Pomponius, allowed her out in fresh air several hours a day, during which time she was allowed to nurse her child. Finally, the Christians were summoned to appear before the judge and urged to deny their Lord, but all remained firm. When Perpetua's turn came, her father suddenly appeared, carrying her infant in his arms, and he begged her to save her own life for the sake of her child. Even the judge seemed to be moved. "Spare the gray hairs of your father," he said. "Spare your child. Offer sacrifice for the welfare of the emperor." Perpetua answered, "I will not sacrifice." "Are you a Christian?" demanded Hilarianus, the judge. "I am a Christian," was her answer. Perpetua and all the other Christians tried with her that day were ordered killed by wild beasts as a show for the crowd on the next holiday. They entered the place of execution clad in their simplest of robes, Perpetua singing a hymn of triumph. The men were to be torn to pieces by leopards and bears. Perpetua and a young woman named Felicitas were hung up in nets, at first naked, but the crowd demanded that they should be allowed their clothing. When they were again returned to the arena, a bull was let loose on them. Felicitas fell, seriously wounded. Perpetua was tossed with her loose robe torn and her hair falling loose, but she hastened to the side of the dying Felicitas and gently raised her from the ground. When the bull refused to attack them again, they were dragged out of the arena, to the disappointment of the crowd, which wanted to see their deaths. Finally, brought back in to be killed by gladiators, Perpetua was assigned to a trembling young man, who stabbed her weakly several times, not being used to such scenes of violence. When she saw how upset the young man was, Perpetua guided his sword to a vital area and died. The seventh persecution, A.D. 249. By now, the heathen temples of Rome were almost forsaken, and the Christian churches were crowded with converts. The emperor, Decius, decided it was time to crush the Christians once and for all. Fabian, the bishop of Rome, was the first person of authority to feel the severity of this persecution. The former emperor, Philip, had put his treasure into the care of Fabian. When Decius examined the treasure, there was far less than he had expected, so he had Fabian arrested and beheaded. Decius, having built a pagan temple at Ephesus, commanded everyone in the city to sacrifice to its idols. The order was refused by 7 of his own soldiers: Maximaeus, Martinius, Jonas, Malchus, Dionysius, Constantinius, and Sarion. The emperor, willing to try a little persuasion, gave them time to consider until he returned from a journey. But in his absence they escaped and hid in a cave. Decius was told of this on his return, and the mouth of the cave was closed up, so all 7 soldiers starved to death. Theodora, a beautiful young lady of Antioch, refused to sacrifice to the Roman idols, and was condemned to a prison. Didymus, her Christian lover, disguised himself as a Roman soldier and went into Theodora's cell, where he convinced her to put on his armor and escape. When he was discovered, Didymus was taken to the governor and condemned to death. When she heard of Didymus's sentence, Theodora threw herself at the judge's feet and begged that she be the one to suffer, not Didymus. The judge ordered them both beheaded, and their bodies burned. Origen, the celebrated author and teacher of Alexandria, was arrested at the age of 64 and thrown into prison in chains, his feet placed in the stocks, which held his legs stretched widely apart. Even though Origen was rich and famous, he received no mercy. He was threatened by fire and tormented by every means available, but his fortitude carried him through it all, even when the judge ordered the torturers to prolong his suffering. During the torture, Decius died, and his successor began a war with the Goths, which turned the empire's attention away from the Christians. Origen was freed. He lived in Tyre until he died at the age of 69. Chapter 2. The Eighth Persecution, A.D. 257. When Valerian was first made emperor, he was a moderate and kind to the Christians, but then he fell under the influence of an Egyptian magician named Martyrs, and ordered the persecutions to continue, which they did for the next 3 years and 6 months. Stephen, bishop of Rome, was beheaded, and Saturnius, bishop of Toulouse, was attacked and seized by the crowd there for preventing the oracles from speaking. On refusing to sacrifice to the idols, he was fastened by the feet to the tail of a bull, which was then driven down the steps of the temple, dragging Saturnius until his head opened and his brains fell out. None of the Christians in Toulouse had the courage to carry away his dead body until 2 women took it and buried it in a ditch. In Rome, Lawrence was brought before the authorities, who knew he was not only a minister of the sacraments, but also a distributor of the church's riches. When they demanded he hand over all that the church possessed, Lawrence asked for 3 days to collect it. On the 3rd day, when the persecutor demanded the wealth of the church, Lawrence stretched his arms over a group of poor Christians he had gathered together. "These are the precious treasures of the church," he said. What more precious jewels can Christ have than those in whom he promised to dwell? Furious at being tricked and out of his mind with anger, Lawrence's persecutor ordered him whipped, beaten, tied to burning hot plates of iron, then laid on a bed of iron over a fire and roasted alive. The first English martyr was a man named Alban, who was converted by a poor clerk who took shelter in his house. When the authorities eventually came for the clerk, Alban dressed in his clothes and went in his place. The judge recognized Alban and demanded he sacrifice to the heathen gods or die. When Alban refused, he was tortured and beheaded. The 9th persecution, AD 270. This persecution began under the Emperor Aurelian. Among those who suffered at this time was Felix, Bishop of Rome, who was beheaded. Agapitus, a young Roman who sold his estate and gave the money to the poor, was seized as a Christian, tortured, and then brought to Praenest, a city near Rome, where he was beheaded. These are the only martyrs whose names were recorded during this reign. The 10th persecution, AD 303. In the beginning of the 10th persecution, which was in the 19th year of his reign, the emperor Diocletian appointed Maximian to share his throne with him, and the 2 of them chose Galerius and Constantius to serve under them. Under these 2 rulers the Christians were again persecuted furiously, a state that would continue until AD 313, even though Diocletian and Maximian gave up their offices in the year 305. Constantius and Galerius divided the empire between them, Galerius taking the eastern countries and Constantius ruling France, Spain, and Britain. Meanwhile, the Roman soldiers set up Maxentius as their Caesar in Rome. While Galerius and Maxentius continued the persecution for 7 or 8 years, Constantius became a supporter of the Christians in his empire, being an enlightened, intelligent ruler who was always concerned for the welfare of his subjects, never waging unjust wars or aiding those who did. Churches were terribly persecuted in other parts of the empire, but Constantius gave Christians the freedom to live and worship as they chose, even appointing them as his closest protectors and advisors. Constantius died in AD 306 and was buried at York, England. His son, Constantine, an English-born Christian, succeeded him, a ruler every bit as compassionate and dedicated as his father. In Rome, Maxentius was ruling as a tyrant, killing his own noblemen, confiscating their goods for himself, and practicing magic, the only thing he seemed to do well. In the beginning of his reign, he pretended to be a friend of the Christians, but only to win popular support, while he secretly continued the persecution. The citizens and senators of Rome soon grew wary of Maxentius's tyranny and wickedness, and petitioned Constantine to come free them. At first Constantine tried to convince Maxentius to mend his ways, but when they had no effect, he gathered an army in Britain and France and began marching towards Italy in AD 313. Knowing he didn't have the support of his people, Maxentius had to rely on his magic arts and occasional ambushes of Constantine's advancing army, neither of which slowed Constantine's advance towards Rome. But as he neared Rome, Constantine began to feel nervous about the coming battle. He'd seen Maxentius defeat others by use of his magic, and he wished he had a force he could use against it. At one sunset, Constantine looked up at the south to see the bright form of the cross and the words, "In this overcome." He and the men with him were astonished at the sign, although no one was too sure what it actually meant. But one night, as Constantine slept, Christ appeared to him with the same cross, telling him to make a cross and carry before him into battle. This sign and its message wasn't given to induce superstitious worship of the cross, as though the cross had any power in itself, but as an admonition to seek Jesus and set forth the glory of his name. The next day Constantine had a cross made of gold and precious stones, which he had carried before the army in place of his flag, which added confidence that God had blessed his cause. He hurried towards Rome and the showdown with Maxentius.